present his work on green civil war, sacrifice zones for climate security, and conflict over public lands in the California desert. Let's hear it for Dr. Mulvaney.
Thank you. Thank you for that impromptu, on-the-spot introduction. So today I'm going to talk to you all about something that is of dear interest to me, which is how do we actually deploy a diffuse energy renewable resource that we need. We're going to have to rely on the sun at some point, whether we like it or not. And how do we balance those considerations with the wildlife considerations? As we shift away from the rich fossil fuels that accumulated over hundreds of millions of years, we then have to collect a very diffuse energy resource, which requires a lot of land. And this means, particularly for wind and solar, to replace relatively small footprints on Earth. And of course, they're extracting from very large bodies of oil and coal deposits under in the subterranean environment. But as we shift toward more renewables, it's going to take more land. And this is just the reality of capturing a diffuse energy resource. And what that means is that as we roll more and more of this out, we're going to encounter more conflicts. Conflicts, in this case I'm going to talk about today, is conflict over public lands, which are lands in particular managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the nation's largest landlord and manager over 250 million acres in the United States. But you can imagine other conflicts as well, conflicts between prime agricultural lands and solar energy production, right? We're running out of food, so how does that actually balance out? So all these considerations are really important to me, and what I wanted to do is understand kind of the sources of some of the first few conflicts that have emerged around siting solar power plants and balancing some of the species conservation issues that we're also really interested in having. And this is a picture from an organization called Basin and Range Watch, who's been an incredible resource for me in learning about what's happening on the ground. They're on the ground with solar power plant applications all the time, taking pictures, documenting wildlife. It's led by two former tortoise biologists who used to work for the BLM and have been a little bit upset with what they see as kind of the encroachment of solar power plants and industrialization of otherwise pristine wilderness areas out in the public lands of California. So you can see this is obviously doesn't quite look like this out there yet, but this is what they fear happening, right? Is this industrial landscape with a few national parks that are kind of fenced in, and this is not necessarily what we want to see for wildlife going forward. So you notice there's a word in the title called a sacrifice zone, and I want to just kind of describe what that concept is. And the person who really, there's a few people who introduced this in the sociological literature. There is a woman named Valerie Kulitz who looked at the atomic test site as a national sacrifice zone. So public lands, again, used to detonate nuclear explosives. And the definition of a sacrifice zone is a geographical area that is permanently degraded, or on our kind of time scales, for the benefit or the common good. Right? And the atomic test zone was seen as a place, we got to blow up something if we're going to use nuclear weapons to defend national security. Well, that was seen as a sacrifice zone. So we can imagine then we're going to have to sacrifice some lands for renewable energy development. So the question is, what do those landscapes look like? And I'm going to talk about what that meant for a particular couple of power plants, particularly one in the Idaho Valley, California. Now this has been captured by some people as what we call the green civil war, right? And this is balancing solar energy projects, something all green folks want, right? Environment, more solar power plants, but conservation issues. We want to see more wildlife too. So these things are at odds a little bit, particularly out in the Mojave. So if we think about impacts from climate change, which is what we're trying to respond to with solar power plants, no place south of the Arctic Circle will be impacted by climate change more than the Mojave Desert and the California deserts, and maybe we call that a little extremes. Pretty hard to predict changes in precipitation, but ecologists, I've heard this from ecologists. Some ecologists might challenge whether that's actually true, but this is what we're trying to balance, is how to protect a place that's going to be disrupted by climate change with technologies that will protect us from climate change. So you can see that. These data are a little old, but it shows you really how much utility scale solar power plants, and that's going to be the main focus for my talk today, have taken to the land. So you can see, and I should have put these in land units, but typically with a solar power plant, you're talking about 10 megawatts per acre. But you can see in California, there's a couple things we could draw from this. So you can see a couple states in particular are going to feed California's energy demand in the future. So all these 3 states, Nevada, Arizona, and California, will be providing solar energy to the utilities, PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric in particular. And we only need about 15,000 to 20,000 to reach this 33% goal. That is now a 50, so this is a renewable portfolio standard goal. That is the amount of electricity that is required by the utility to be purchased from renewable sources. So that's now 50%, so we can increase that by, another, maybe double that by 50%. So you can see we probably only need maybe 30,000 or 25,000 megawatts. And if you see under construction and permitting, we already are kind of approaching that number. So hopefully we've got the institutions set up to make sure we appropriately site these projects. And what I'll argue is that we did develop these, but these institutions came a little bit too late to actually affect the projects that are being permitted and cited today. But bottom line is this is a real thing. Solar power plants are taken to the landscape, and they are already generating these land use conflicts that we're interested in. This is an illustration of a particular day in California. This is pretty cool. Since I started teaching here in 2011, I used to show this graph of how much solar energy was being generated in the day. It was a little sliver. 5 years later, it's already, this big giant bump in the middle of the day. This is a daily curve of electricity generation from different sources, and the yellow represents the amount of solar energy being integrated on the grid. And this is 2013. Like I said, this sliver was like, barely even see the yellow. I used to have to be like, if you squint, you can see the solar, the daily output is. But today you see this huge bump. This, of course, causes other problems, because this means when the sun goes down, we got to ramp up a whole bunch of other resources, but that's another issue. We've had days where we've generated 40-50% of our electricity on a Saturday afternoon with not much demand from solar already. So we're seeing huge amounts of solar electricity in the electricity grid in California already. So what does this mean? How do we think about this in terms of planning for this transition? And there's a kind of emerging literature out of science and technology studies and political ecology that's trying to think about what can we learn about these systems and conflicts today to help plan for the future. And I'll read to you what it says over here. The social planning for energy transition is the process of seeking to understand and prepare for the social implications and outcomes of energy transitions in general. In California, it'll be solar energy transition. Someplace that's less sunny, it might be the wind energy transition. In California, we'll have wind too. And then develop strategies for incorporating these considerations. We know that there's some sort of conflict that might emerge. How do we plan for and think about that in future planning and for calls for proposals for new power, permitting, and things like that? And then how that affects energy policy and planning. Now, there's a broader phenomenon, research community interested in this particular phenomenon called the social gap in green energy deployment. And that is, if I were to poll all of you, let me do it actually. How many of you support green energy or solar energy? Let's say solar energy. How many of you support solar energy? Oh, it looks like 100%. If we did a national poll, it might be 95%. Right? Even if you include like Donald Trump voters, it still is like in the high 90%. So people are favorable toward renewables. However, the social gap is the distance between those who support solar energy generally, but find problems with particular projects. So the social gap in renewable energy is that we find strong, consistent support for renewables in general, but when it comes to particular projects, there's widespread local resistance, and this causes slowdowns in project developments or cancellations of projects at times, or a bad name for solar energy in other contexts as well. So this is the community of research that we're trying to put some of this discussion in. Now, some of the explanations for why we have this social gap are whether or not there's a good public participation process. Right? If a solar developer shows up and suddenly this project's getting built right across the street from your house, you're going to probably feel slightly antagonistic toward that, as if maybe if a scenario were to be that someone showed up, knocked on your door, and thinking about building a solar power plant across from your house, how can we plan for and think about your... Doesn't say that public participation smooths this process, but it says that it helps facilitate and lower some of the tensions we see around there. The decision-making context is important. Does the development of a solar power, and this is more generally about renewable in general, but does this particular project actually help something more broadly? So the qualified support hypothesis might be that this project is going to help our greenhouse gases by lower greenhouse gases by this much. So if there's some kind of sense that that some of the major impacts are acceptable if we have reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what we call the qualified support hypothesis. There's a small, or this is probably the most popular in the public mind for explaining this resistance, and this is NYMBYism. NYMBY, how many people know what NYMBY means, right? Not in my backyard is what that means. And it's just kind of a self-interested, oh, this is my property and I don't want to see that kind of explanation. And as I'll talk about, that when the sociologists actually go and study this, or the geographers go and study this, they find that NYMBYism is actually a strong explanation for these things. It has to do with some of these other ones that I'm talking about. But in the public mind, NYMBYism carries the day usually. Values and beliefs, right? If I'm a burrowing owl ecologist and I know that there's going to be impacts to my favorite bird in a particular area, I'm probably going to not like that project because it kind of speaks against my values. Or if I'm an animal rights person and I know that it's going to impact desert tortoise in a negative way, as we'll talk about it does, you might not support that project. This is similar to the public participation, but it's collaboration with stakeholders could be taken to be more broadly, like maybe collective ownership of the resource. So maybe a community owns the power plant and they got together and planned and collaborated on the project from the ground up. So that usually helps smooth these conflicts as well. And then inequitable power relations, and I'll maybe give it away too much by saying that this turns out to be a really big explanation of what I was seeing out there. Senses of fairness and justice about particular siting projects and who the benefits accrue to turned out to be a pretty strong signal in this work. So I'm just going to give you two broad questions. I had a whole series of research questions I've been asking around this since I've been doing this work since 2008. So what I found in the literature, there's not much discussion about public lands specifically. It's usually wind projects, solar projects, but not about projects on public land. So that really never floated up to the explanation. And I think that I was thinking when I started this work that there would be some tie-in with public lands because this means that we own these lands. It's different than private lands, I would argue, is that there's a distinction, we might say, between whether the projects are sited on lands that are owned collectively by the United States citizens or whether it's a private land that could have anything happen on it anyway. So what shapes the social gap for projects on public lands? And then to kind of fit in the social planning for energy transitions, what can we learn from the experiences of siting these projects to inform better social planning for energy transitions generally? Now the work I would link it to in the literature is something we call political ecology. Okay, and that political ecology, and I'll read off these slides, essentially is interested in understanding access to resources and control over resources, and what are the complex relationships that shape those access and control over resources. Very broadly, if someone were on the street were to say, what does political ecology mean? I would say that it's concerns of ecology or ecosystems or socio-ecologies, and a broadly defined political economy, so understanding how those resources are distributed amongst actors or stakeholders that are involved. And this is kind of the classic political ecology book, Blakey and Brookfield from the 80s. Now, what political ecology does is it's opposed to apolitical narratives. That these things might be, an apolitical narrative might be scarcity or supply-demand relationships explaining particular phenomena, or a lack of education, right? Though we just need to educate folks and then we'll have better environmental outcomes. Not saying that these things don't happen, but these are what would be considered an apolitical narrative. So it's purposely trying to politicize these particular situations. So we focus on questions of power, control, access to resources, and how institutions shape those things. Now this is where it gets a little fuzzy, so to speak. It's not a theory, it's not a method, but it's drawing on key concepts to help explain these socio-environmental outcomes. And most of the political ecology, I would say, is case study based. And what that means is and many of those case studies are idiosyncratic. There's not a pattern really there. You're just trying to understand some strange thing that's happening in a particular place. So it flies in the face of theory building in that way. So it doesn't necessarily build a body of social theory so much as have particular explanations for particular cases. It's multi-method. So there's political ecologists who do semi-structured interviews, do ethnography, and I did a little bit of all these things, just drawing on, because when you have access in different ways, in different venues, you have to use what tools you have available to help try to collect the data as you can. Participant or observation at public meetings. I did probably close to 50 public meetings I went to over the last 7 years. I did not use any survey instruments, but that's what other political ecologists might use. Remote sensing I did not use, but I did use some GIS and some of the work that I'm still working through. Immersive, you call that ethnography, that last one. And then it's multi-sited, so you're trying to understand relationships between global, national, local scales. And in this context, you might think like we're trying to tackle a global environmental problem of climate change and trying to understand that interface with kind of the local ecologies there. So very broadly, we can characterize most political ecological work in two different boxes. And often they try to do both of these things. One is the hatchet, critique of dominant narratives of environmental change. So this might be a critique of NYMBYism or some particular phenomenon that is the dominant explanation but probably doesn't really explain the situation. So that's the hatchet, and this is the seed. So you're trying to understand from those experiences how can we inform social change to be able to have better environmental outcomes or fair distribution of resources and access, etc. So stepping back out now, what we're trying to understand here is how do these environmental conflicts over, in the particular case study I'm going to talk about is Ivanpah Valley, how were these facilitated, or these conflicts facilitated by particular institutions? So there were a couple of key policy drivers that helped drive what we saw as this widespread utility scale solar in California. One is the renewable portfolio standard, and that requires utilities to acquire a certain percentage of their electricity from renewables, and that is up to 50% now. The other one, and this is connected right to the BLM, is through an executive order and then a mandate in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. The BLM was told they need to develop 10 and now it's up to 20 gigawatts of renewable energy on public lands. So the institution that's supposed to, in some cases, protect conservation lands was told they have to industrialize particular landscapes. So you can already see kind of some of the main drivers for some of these conflicts. There are a bunch of kind of financial things that help lower the cost of solar to make it more viable. I won't get into those too much, but most of them are kind of tax equity finance. And then this one's actually a really important one. This is the Department of Energy Loan Guarantee Program, which basically allowed solar companies to have the federal government co-sign a loan. So in the case of Ivanpah, that was a close to $1.6 billion loan that was co-signed with the federal government. Basically, the Treasury would pay for it. If the company was out of business, Treasury will pay for it. And that is because in renewable energy in general, those are seen as risky projects from the financial perspective. If I go and ask for money to build a natural gas power plant, they see natural gas power plants, they understand how they work, they're going to finance that. If I go with a solar power plant, they're going to maybe charge me a really high interest rate for that money. So these actually are really important policy drivers. Now this particular one, there's one other really important one that kind of figures into the story of Ivanpah Valley, which was came out of the Bush Energy Task Force in 2001. If you don't know, when George W. Bush was elected to office, one of the first things he did was get all the energy companies together, and they had about 30 closed-door meetings to try to figure out what the energy landscape should be in the future and what policies were needed. And this ends up shaping the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So a lot of that happens. But early on, one of the things that the president was able to do was pass this particular executive order. And basically it says agencies, and by that any federal agency, but in this case the BLM we're thinking about, shall expedite the review of permits or take other actions as necessary to accelerate the completion of such projects while maintaining safety, public health, and environmental protections. And essentially this is known as fast tracking. So if a project was going to be proposed on public lands, they were now had the authority to fast track the environmental review. So instead of an environmental impact assessment taking 2 years, because it's 5.6 miles, square miles in terms of the area, and we don't know the behavior of species, and we want to be able to collect biological information, that might now be 8 months or 7 months, which you can already see, wait, I need to understand a year's worth of data to understand the system. You can see how this may have also facilitated some of these conflicts. So the Energy Policy Act 2005, I mentioned, had the BLM mandate to develop 10 gigawatts. That's now been extended by Obama to be 20 gigawatts. By the way, look who's up in anyway, that's actually the signing of that bill. Some very big climate advocates in the state. The Energy Policy Act also passed this DOE loan guarantee program. And actually, at the time, it wasn't for renewables. It was only for nuclear power plants, because nuclear power plants are very risky to build. Sure. It might take 15 years, and you're like, hey, I'm going to build a money-making entity that's going to be built in 15 years. No one's going to give you a loan for that. So that was really important. Then when, I'll talk in a minute, when they passed the American Recovery and Investment Act, they allow innovative carbon reduce or greenhouse gas reducing technologies into that. Skip that. So when the mandate was proposed, BLM went through and they subtracted all of the wilderness areas that they weren't allowed to give to solar developers. And they ended up identifying, now they manage across the West about 250 million acres. They identified about 21 million acres that were ready for solar development. And essentially that's what happened. You had a first come, first served process. You had companies that were nothing more than a Jeep driving around with rental car, staking claim to particular lands. And I think they ended up close to 2 million acres of applications at one point. So 2 million acres were going to be proposed development. 30% of that, by the way, was held by Goldman Sachs, who had no solar technology, but were speculating on the land, hoping that they're at, even though you can't really sell public lands, they were in an application line. So that was a little shady there. But the point is, what you're seeing here are the areas of solar development. They actually end up not producing many projects up here. There's a little too much snow in the winter, it's cold. This is the area that really gets pushed for solar energy development, partly because of its proximity to California's lucrative markets and renewable portfolio standard, or probably mainly because of that. So that's the BLM map. And this is where, this is one snapshot, so I monitored this from 2000, well, I had data from 2005 up till 2012. This is a snapshot in 2010 when the BLM issued a programmatic environmental impact statement to try to understand programmatically what things can be streamlined and what couldn't be when evaluating particular projects. So each black square here represents an active, what they call a right-of-way application. So they didn't really have a way to lease out solar lands. All they had was right-of-way leases, and that was based on utility power lines. So they used kind of an existing lease structure for particular projects. What you're seeing in reds were projects that were designated as fast-track projects. Now this is really unclear. Why did some projects get fast-tracked and others not? And the BLM says, well, we took ones that we thought were most financially viable. And it was not a very open process, so we don't actually know how these things were handed out. And you can make the argument, these projects were usually backed by very large corporations, so you can argue, one, that they were very powerful and they were able to access the political hierarchies of the BLM and get projects that way, but also you can say they're largely capitalized companies and maybe less risky companies as well. So Citibank getting a fast track for a project, or Morgan Stanley getting fast track for a project they were proposing. You can see both arguments for why that might have happened. Now, first thing that happens with the BLM mandate is a particular project on what's called the Catullus lands. This is important because the company ends up setting the project in Ivanpah. Now first, we have a gentleman named Robert F. Kennedy. You may have heard of him. He's like a famous environmental speaker. He probably gets $10,000, $50,000 per speaking gig. Right? Robert F. Kennedy, who's very well opposed to building wind farms, by the way, off of the coast of his Nantucket Sound residence in Massachusetts. Right here he says some places should be off limits to any sort of industrial development, and that's the shoal that's off the 10 miles off the coast from the Kennedy compound. He was basically excoriating environmentalists in the news for being opposed to a particular solar project that a company that his venture capital company owned or invested in was proposing. And here you can see here, I respect that the belief that it's all local, but they're putting the democratic process and sound scientific judgment on hold to jeopardize the energy future of our country. So you can see this man is very replete with contradictions to some extent, right? He's saying very different things in very different landscapes with very different implications. You might say he's a NYMBY, actually. Oops, let's skip through here. So the Catellus lands are a very interesting artifact. They're actually a legacy of the Santa Fe Railroad, or whatever that railroad was called. And the way that the BLM, or the Homestead Act, gave away lands to the railroad companies was to give a checkerboard, essentially. They didn't actually get every parcel, they got a checkerboard that they could operate through. And these were kind of legacy lands the BLM would own. So what you have here is this is the Mojave National Preserve, Joshua Tree National Park is down here. That's 29 Palms military base. So the BLM had most of this land, most of the land that's not red, and the Catellus lands were red lands. So an organization called the Wildlands Conservancy went through, because all these they're privately held, so they could be developed ostensibly by someone wanting to build real estate developments or a casino or whatever. I get maybe not casino in Nevada, but what happened was the Wildlands Conservancy acquired all this land. Actually, a gentleman named David Gelbaum, who turns out to be a very big donor to Dianne Feinstein, acquired all of this land and donated it to the BLM. So the Wildlands Conservancy went through, bought all this land, donated to the BLM. So now the BLM doesn't have to deal with a checkerboard, which is difficult to manage. Now they actually have a very whole piece. So what happened was BLM then flipped that land back to the solar developers, causing all sorts of anxiety. So I actually have the letter. This is actually the letter from Bill Clinton saying, "Thank you, Wildlands Conservancy, for buying all this land and donating it to the BLM. We're going to protect it in perpetuity." And then come 2006, the BLM, because they have a mandate to develop renewables, flipped some of this land to solar developers. That caused all sorts of controversy. So anyhow, at one point, Gelbaum actually is a big investor for venture capital and solar companies in general. At one point, BrightSource, the developer proposing this project, backed away and retreated. This is what they were going to focus on this first area. Actually, here's a desert tortoise that I found walking the site with a guy named David Arda, who set up the desert conservation plan for desert tortoise out in the 1980s. This is Robert F. Kennedy's reaction. So what Feinstein ended up doing, and one of the reasons that BrightSource withdrew, was Feinstein proposed 2 national monuments that would be right across the Catellus lands. And that's why BrightSource decided to back out, because their investors they said, oh, it's protected land, we're not going to actually do anything. Those haven't been passed still, by the way. I think Obama might turn them into national monuments before he leaves office. But you can see a quote here. This is arguably the best solar land in the world, and Senator Feinstein shouldn't be allowed to take this land off the table without proper and scientific environmental review. Again, contradicting his position on Cape Wind off the coast of Nantucket Sound. But anyhow, so enter ARA. So at this time, even though there were projects being cited and proposed, there's still no money to build these. It was all private money at this point. The American Recovery and Investment Act gets passed in 2009, and what they do, 2 things. One, they pass a program called Section 1603. So one of the incentives for someone who wants to buy solar is they get to take 30% off the price and deduct it from their taxes. So it makes solar much, much cheaper. So if I'm a big private company, that's a good deal, because I often I got all this money that I could pay in taxes, I want to deduct my tax bill a little bit. It's basically free money in that sense. However, if I'm a startup and I have no profits, I can't take advantage of that, because I have no tax liability. So what am I going to deduct it from? I don't have a tax bill. So this particular program turned that the investment tax credit, is what it's called, into a grant program. So companies could actually just apply for a grant, and they would get that 30% deducted just through a straight grant. And about $10 billion had been spent up to 2012 in grants through this program. So lots of money was being invested here. Remember I mentioned the loan guarantee program earlier that was initially slated for nuclear development. They expand the criteria for evaluation to consider non-commercial or innovative technologies. And that's where you get the solar and some of these other flywheels and some other kind of technologies into this program. So now companies that didn't quite have a commercially ready project would be able to borrow money and in the case of BrightSource, it was $1.6 billion to be able to build the projects they wanted to build. And this is just a list of, again, another $10 billion was spent on these particular projects, about $13 billion in solar overall for some manufacturing facilities. But these are the companies that were able to take advantage of loan guarantees. And all these projects, well, there are 2 of these projects that are on private lands, but any project that was on public lands got fast-tracked. So there's some coordination between the agencies, the Department of Energy and BLM for this. So you can see the project I'm going to talk about here is BrightSource's project. It's $1.6 billion. They put down, I think, close to $300 million. It's a very interesting set of arrangements. I'll show you who those players are in a few minutes here. So what does this mean? So let me step back for a second. The context for why we saw all these people coming to these particular landscapes, we can reduce to 3 particular phenomena. 1, creating new markets. Right, so now you have utilities required to buy electricity from renewable sources. So if I'm a solar developer, I suddenly say, now I have a market, I don't have to compete with natural gas. There's actually a carved out market for me to sell electricity into. Socializing risky investments. Right, so I said before, solar projects are typically risky. If I went to a bank, it's very hard for me to get a loan, and the loan I would get had a very high interest rate. ARA's loan guarantee program essentially co-signed those loans. So what would otherwise be a risky investment turns out to be less risky from that perspective. And then the BLM mandate to actually build these particular projects. So I call these virtual land privatizations because they weren't actually privatized, but they were in effect privatized because the fence was put up around them and they were no longer public lands when they were converted this way. So these are the 3 drivers for why we saw these particular projects take to these landscapes. So that, if you just walked in, this is all you need to know from what I've talked about already. Big context. Now, almost immediately we started seeing in particular projects animals being harmed, injured, particularly some projects that were involving endangered species. So this is actually the Genesis project. In this case, they had a bunch of Mojave kit fox on site with a bunch of kit fox dens, and they had to evict the kit fox before they could build the project. They decided to spray coyote urine, and now they had the first cases of distemper in the kit fox population. So you can argue that in some cases now we have these green projects coming into these parks, and it's undermining the greenness of renewable energy projects, right? Is this a sustainable project? Kind of depends. Native American issues. This is actually the same project. I actually remember standing above on a hill with a Native American elder. He was pointing to this particular site saying, there's a watering hole on the far corner of that property. Everywhere there's a watering hole, our people buried people. So what did and that was ignored by the BLM. So as they developed this particular project, they found Native American remains, and they actually had to put a little fence around that particular area. Excuse me. Native American artifacts. So these are geoglyphs, or intaglios is another word. These are actually things we didn't know were in the Mojave Desert until we developed airplanes to fly over, and we started seeing these giant stick figures that Native Americans had built in the landscape. And you can see this is a particular intaglio that's now been turned into a road for the building of a particular solar power plant. This one actually was never built. So we actually sacrificed something for nothing in this particular case. And then you have all sorts of other kind of what I would call, well actually let me maybe introduce this concept now. A historian named Donald Worcester, really fantastic author if you've ever read anything about it, he distinguishes between 2 types of nature. Extraordinary nature and nature. There's ordinary nature. And he says we have a tendency to want to preserve extraordinary nature. So very charismatic species and things like that. But the mundane, everyday things like a Mojave yucca, that maybe doesn't deserve the protections as maybe the desert tortoise in this particular area, or a Joshua tree. Like these very kind of charismatic looking animals. But you can see here, look what this yucca does. Lynn, is this what you know as one of these burrows that maybe some animals, these particular yuccas, their root formations help create burrows for some of the animals that live in these particular areas.
Is that the root of the...
That's the root now after it's decayed. After the plant is decayed, it's left these little burrows. So that was actually not dug by an animal. That's a rotting yucca root that's created a burrow in here. So we know that ordinary nature creates habitat for extraordinary nature, in this particular case, for a desert tortoise, or I don't think there was burrowing owl on this particular site. But this is actually taken from the Ivanpah site itself by the Basin Range folks to illustrate the importance of this species. So what this means is we might be predisposed, or maybe it's not. I'll just argue. I'm going to argue that one of the reasons that we see some of these conflicts emerge is a lot of the people advocating for particular projects saw desert ecosystems as wastelands, as ordinary nature, even though it has some charismatic species in it, right? But when you actually go out there, especially if you go out there after a rainy event and everything's in bloom, where you get an opportunity to see some of these magnificent wildlife out there, you realize it's actually not wasteland at all. These are actually very, rich ecosystems. Actually, the Eastern Mojave Desert is probably according to some of the biologists I've talked to, the most intact desert ecosystem or high elevation desert ecosystem in the world, in terms of its how the size of it and how much interconnection there is in the area. There's a kit box. Sorry to show you the dead one. I did not mean, but it is whatever. I'm going to skip this. It's just again showing that these particular places, not only because of nature reasons, but these are held to be important by also Native Americans who see these as landscapes that are that they've been caretakers of for many, many centuries or millennia, and now they're being turned over for renewable energy development. So the project I'm going to kind of start talking a little more about now is this Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating Station. And this is actually the Nevada-California border. You can see the Mojave National Preserve here is actually another island of the Mojave National Preserve here. So it's a valley right on the edge of California. In the center of the valley is a giant lake bed. It used to be a lake, and the lake is no longer there, or water flowed for many years and always evaporates. And you can see mountain ranges surround the entire valley. That's a golf course, actually. So that was often like the comparison with the projects, is they would say, oh, but you think that we're going to be bad with our solar power plant. What about that golf course that's there? So they're always trying to like push folks over to the golf course. It is kind of strange to see a golf course out there. But anyhow, so the project you're going to see gets built out here. I remember camping right at the base of this is called metamorphic rock here, right before they actually fenced off the area for power plant development. But that's what it looks like from the sky. This is what it looks like from the ground. So a lot of creosote bush. These are actually really neat plants. So these grow clonally, and they could live for they found some that they think were clonally growing for 30,000 years. So these can be really, really old, even though they look kind of scraggly looking out there. And one of the reasons they cited this project here was because there were already big power lines draped across this landscape. So, and actually there's kind of a history of the Ivanpah Valley. It was once going to be proposed as an airport for Las Vegas after 9/11, because the airport in Las Vegas is right downtown. So they wanted to get the airport out of town. They're going to put an airport in here, but that got defeated. And this is what the proposal looked like. See, again, they point out the golf course here. So this is about 45 minutes from Las Vegas. If you're ever in Las Vegas, it's really worth a trip to go just see the power plant itself is very neat. It does get built. And they called it the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating Station. Again, this is owned by BrightSource. Now again, why did BrightSource get picked to get a loan and to get fast track? Well, this is the complex layers of social actors that were involved here. So we could see the company, well, first of all, the chairman of BrightSource is the founder of the NRDC, giant environmental group. He ends up being actually the commerce secretary after leaving this particular spot. So very, very powerful political actors. The designer, Arnold Goldman, actually built many of the existing solar power plants in the California desert, which are solar parabolic troughs. And he won an Innovator Award from the World Economic Forum the year before this happened. So he was seen as like a very kind of cutting edge Elon Musk of solar energy, if you were to think of it that way. And then you had a whole bunch of really other big powerful actors. So here are all the investors: CalSTARS, Google.org, Chevron, BP, Morgan Stanley, Vantage Point Capital. You can get the gist of it. So very, very big, powerful actors. And there's RFK Jr. The electricity would eventually, the power plant itself would actually be owned by NRG, a very, very large owner of power plants across the United States. These are the people they sell electricity to. The people that would construct the project, Bechtel, very, very large corporation. They built the Hoover Dam, so they have a history in the area of actually building energy projects. And some of the other major players in the supply chain, Dow, Chemical. Gestamp actually is the company is to provide the steel. As you see some project pictures of it, you'll see there's a lot of steel in this thing. It's actually owned by the largest bank in Spain. So these are very, very powerful political actors. So we can start to say, well, there's a political economy that's saying which projects get selected for development here. Here's the star of the early part of the show, which is the desert tortoise. And this was really important because they knew there were desert tortoise in this particular habitat. And I put a GPS sign here because they actually, when they picked, they had to relocate them. Just like the kit fox, they had to evict all the desert tortoises. So they actually, when they, as part of the biological opinion, they were required to actually put a GPS on them and follow them. And unfortunately, a large portion of them have died. I think they moved 154 and about 70 of them ended up dying. Now early on, they had surveyed, when they were still, before the project had actually been approved, they had done some surveys. Now desert tortoise is very hard to survey for because they spend 90% of their time in a burrow. So if you're not there at the right time, you're not going to see them. And they did two successive years, 2007, 2008 survey. They only found 13. So like that's a manageable number to move. So the biological opinion approved the project. So Fish and Wildlife has to write off and say, okay, you got endangered species there. We're going to issue a take permit for up to a certain amount. That take permit was 36. When they after they approved the project, started clearing, they found 24 already, just on 1/3 of the land. So Fish and Wildlife, that raised flags for them, and they were like, wait a second, you guys, your biologists told us there's only this many. It looks like you're going to find a lot more. So they had to go through a reconsultation. They almost actually pulled the plug at that point. But again, if you saw all the actors involved, you can imagine all sorts of telephone calls happening in the background. I have no data to say that, but that's kind of, you can imagine that happening. Now, what happened was BLM eventually did a big study and said, well, this particular project over its life is going to end up harming thousands of tortoise because the offspring of tortoise and things like that. And one of the other things, so, okay, well, you got to move 24 tortoises or you got to move 150, it's no big deal. Well, we know that translocations of tortoises actually don't work very well. Desert tortoise can live for 100 years. They don't like to be picked up by humans. Humans transfer a virus to them. And there was just a project approved or done to expand a military base about 3 years before where they moved close to 400 and half of them died within 6 months or within a year, so a very short time. So they know that it's very ineffective, and take literally means kill in this case, in most cases. The ones that they did end up moving, they would put them in these pens, and then they would check for viruses, and then make sure they're healthy over the winter, and then they would release them the next year once they outfitted them with the tortoise. So now you're seeing the project actually getting built here. And one of the first successes for environmental groups was they were concerned about a couple of plants that were in here. So the original proposals were to clear all of this land, so they actually ended up leaving a lot of this land intact. So that was one of the positives that came out of the earlier development. So you can see metamorphic rock here again on a campsite somewhere. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. So as I mentioned, I looked at lots of public comments, and I did close to 300 interviews now over the last 7 years with various stakeholders, from a lot of activists, a lot of biologists, project developers, those kinds of folks. So I'm going to read through a quote. I did not interview Governor Schwarzenegger, but this is a talk he gave. Right? So they say we want renewable energy, but we don't want to put it anywhere. I mean, if we can't put solar power plants in the Mojave Desert, I don't know where the hell we can put it. Right? And this is kind of reinforcing that desert is a wasteland, good for nothing else kind of perspective that we might see here. Here we go. This is an activist. Industrial development in this region has the potential not only to remove habitat directly, but to cut off wildlife corridors. And we're talking about really big projects that wildlife can't move through these anymore, necessarily. Here, the desert tortoise. Later on, it becomes the bighorn sheep becomes a really important one. So development of one of these projects that is so large could end up cutting off the connectivity that many wildlife species require to maintain their genetic diversity. Now this is actually accentuated by climate change, where we're going to start seeing species shift in different directions. So if now they've got a giant fence, their ability to adapt to climate change is somewhat is minimized, or the species becomes more vulnerable. Here's an activist. Should we save the desert tortoise or plow over its power plants that can help us save ourselves? And this is the context for this person was to say, this power plant is just going to be powering air conditioners in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. How can we think of a way to do this in such a way that maybe there's a kind of demand side response there? And this is also seen as a lot of the activists in this area have seen a history of dumps going out to the desert, or all these kind of industrial facilities that no one wants, a hazardous waste incinerator out in the desert because they don't want it in the urban area. So they kind of see this as an externality being pushed onto them from afar. Here, these are all pictures by this guy named Jamie Stillings. Amazing stuff, by the way. Solar development should all be happening on rooftops. So here they're not only saying, why are we taking the burden here, but they're saying, why aren't other alternatives being explored here? Like, why does the renewable portfolio standard have to be met by giant, large-scale solar power plants? Why can't we do this in a more distributed way? So having on rooftops and in cities, but that wouldn't profit the big utilities. So they're already seeing kind of, again, encroachment from big solar. There's lots of no big solar bumper stickers I saw out there, right? We think of big oil, maybe there is a kind of a big solar to be thinking about here. So we wreck the desert instead. So again, this is a local citizen. Roughly 5 to 10% of species, plant species in the eastern Mojave haven't been described yet. So if we actually look at, this is a gentleman at the UC Reserve, and so he's concerned that he's actually discovered like 20 varieties of plants that no one had ever documented before. And he showed me a map once of plant voucher specimens for California, where the biologists will sample plant species and send them away to I'm forgetting what the library of plant species is, but they send it away to monitor and to kind of track what species are where, catalog, I guess is a better word. And he showed me a map of where those all came from. Barely any are coming from the Mojave Desert. Because if you're a plant ecologist, don't you want to be sampling like the coastal range of California? Why do you want to be out there in the middle of the desert in a really hot environment planting? And that's one of his theories. But he's basically saying he's seeing these power plants as basically bulldozing areas that we haven't actually well documented yet. So you could see from an ecological perspective what a botanist might see there. So here's some Native American groups. Now, Native American groups are supposed to have a special relationship with the BLM because a lot of this land is public land. They're supposed to get prior consent or at least participation in projects before they're developed. And so you can see here's a couple of quotes. So they have, this is a Chemehuevi elder. By the way, Ivanpah means clean or fresh water in Chemehuevi. So even though there's no water there on the surface, there historically was. So they're getting squeezed out. We're their protectors. So he sees Native Americans as kind of the stewards of these particular landscapes over tens of thousands of years. Ants, rats, turtles, nobody speaks for them. Right? There's hawks, there's snakes, they live here, we live here. You've got to remember, there was no LA, there was no Las Vegas. Where do you think we lived? So they're seeing these public lands as part of their heritage, and the industrialization of these particular landscapes as an affront to that heritage. Here's another quote. I did not interview Jerry Brown, but I got this out of a newspaper article. Some kind of opposition you have to crush. You have to push, or we're not going to get to the goal. So you can see from the top-down policy perspective, they're looking at that 50%, or what at the time 33%. They're trying to get to that portion of renewable energy, and without these big projects, they don't see it. They think patching together small little projects isn't going to get us there. What you have to do is dump a bunch of these large projects on the landscape. So you're seeing, again, and this would probably also affirm the desert as a wasteland perspective here. I have a couple more of these. Why are public lands being auctioned off to energy developers? Look around, there's plenty of private land. If you drive around the Mojave Desert, you see all sorts of abandoned alfalfa fields, and in fact, the area right around Blythe, there's all sorts of, they're losing their water rights, or they're selling their water rights to Los Angeles and other cities. So you're seeing landscapes that are already degraded. Why aren't projects being facilitated there? And this is why there's kind of an institutional problem here, because the BLM mandate is attracting projects to ecologically sensitive sites, as opposed to other places where we might be putting projects without these kinds of conflicts. And there were a few projects that were put on degraded land, so we're good. Here's another one. They seem to want to do it, solar energy development, at the price of destroying history. It's an assault. They've already wiped out lots of things. Now they want to wipe out the desert and any evidence of our past. And that's a Quechan tribal leader, again, seeing this as an affront to their cultural heritage. And one or two more. The argument that we must sacrifice, again, thinking about that sacrifice zone, sacrifice fragile ecosystems for the common good. is specious. It relies on a false choice, right? And reflects a myopic view of the common good. Do we seriously believe a single coal-fired or nuclear power plant will not be built or shut down if this solar project is constructed? So they're pointing out something that really didn't enter the discourse. It was projects versus preservation before. But and what he's pointing, or this person's pointing out, and some of the others are pointing out, there were other alternatives that could have been explored here. Of course, we must do our part to address climate change, but not at the expense of an irreplaceable community jewel. And this was an activist who, this was a Natural Resource Agency. Activists at this around this time were also trying to propose this as a wilderness area, an AC, I'm forgetting the acronym for it, but basically an area of significant environmental concern, which gets special management priorities under the BLM. So lots of people were seeing this as a really important place. Can we slow down a little bit and get an energy plan? Right, this is reflecting the fast tracking. And this again shows the institutional issues that were raised here. So all those Department of Energy loan guarantees I told you about that these companies were getting, they had to break ground before a certain date. Otherwise, the looming Republican Congress that was about to take over in 2012 would have pulled all that money off the table. So again, you see maybe not conspiracy to make bad projects, you see kind of the institutional, even if it's a good, well-reasoned kind of policy or program, it was seeing this kind of political layer and the need to actually accelerate the development of projects to make sure they get built. Otherwise, they don't get built at all. Right? And they saw that as actually the kind of the seesaw that they were on, build it or not. And I love this quote. You might like this quote. This is an old-growth desert. I never heard this until I started interviewing. I heard it 3 or 4 times from different folks. So the activist community must have seen this. And they showed me barrel cactus that were 130 years old. They showed me the Mojave yucca that they think was 300 years old, right on Ivanpah's site. Would we treat an ancient redwood forest this way? Right, and that kind of speaks to this extraordinary nature. They're like, yes, of course we treat redwood forests like this. We did it all over the place in California. But not anymore, hopefully. I mean, we don't... Not redwood forests on public lands, maybe.
We'll talk about that in a couple of
Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. But so, and again, these are actually all these background pictures are from Ivanpah. Again, Jamie's doing some amazing artwork there. So, while the desert tortoise really was the first species of concern, the shift from this again, I didn't really talk about the technology. The technology is solar power tower, and what it uses is heliostats, and heliostats are just giant mirrors, and the mirrors focus on a central point. And then that heat is collected to boil water, which turns a turbine. So everything from once you boil water, it's just like a regular power plant. So this was raised early on, but no one had any evidence. Actually, there was a little evidence from some earlier power towers that were built in California, a couple of pilot ones that were the birds, the temperature of the solar flux. Now the bright light attracts insects, especially as it's getting darker in the day. The solar flux is very hot, and it's hot enough to melt the keratin in the feathers of birds. So they started seeing birds singe. They found a peregrine falcon dead. They also saw lots of collisions. There's something called the lake effect. And activists also said, when you turn the power plant off, don't put all the mirrors straight up, because birds are going to think it's a giant lake. Yeah. And we're starting to see lots and lots of collisions with birds as well here. So you're seeing kind of some of the documentation from these, from the resource agencies who were tasked with trying to track this particular phenomenon. This was actually a guy, his name's Peter Sorensen. He was a division chief, Fish and Wildlife Service, and he put there's another project being proposed after Ivanpah called Hidden Hills. So again, if you're a startup company, one power plant is not your only project. You want to build other projects. So Hidden Hills was another project, and this guy, unbeknownst to his superiors, put this letter in the public record, basically calling for a moratorium on solar power towers until we understand the impacts on birds. And he's concerned about particularly big raptors and some of the ones that you saw before. This is actually from a journal article from the 80s that showed that this was an issue. This gentleman was actually relocated very quickly to the Pacific Northwest, so he's no longer employed in that particular area. Actually, there's 2 projects, Hidden Hills and Rio Mesa. Those are 2 other Bright Source projects. The power towers there were going to be taller, so you can imagine more issues. So we still had no documentation of this issue. All we were really thinking about was the tortoise at this time until the first year of operation, where now they've done actually studies to count the number of dead birds on these particular sites, and these were two of the headlines. Ivanpah project kills 3,500 birds in the first year of operation, when it only actually put out 40% of the electricity it was designed to, and they removed the natural gas cap that they were only allowed to burn in the middle. So there's all these complicated things going on with this project. Of course, they blame Obama. Fish and Wildlife Service, interestingly, their ecologists were saying Bright Source could actually be a mega trap, meaning that ecologically you're drawing animals from all over the place with these bright lights. These are this one's not on right now. This is a picture I took a couple years ago after seeing the construction of the project. So you can imagine this thing might be a beacon attracting wildlife to their doom in the solar flux, where this very high temperature is actually very present. So, okay, so a couple points. So we have, so how do we plan for this? How do we think about it? Well, as they started developing the projects, in 2009, the BLM embarked on a solar programmatic environmental impact assessment. So they were tasked with trying to look at all this 21 million acres that they were proposing would be solar ready and ready for development, and try to identify parcels within those 21 million acres that were more suitable for development. They're trying to find the most degraded of the public lands because they might be the best spots to put solar. At the same time, when we passed the initial, actually a little earlier, when we passed the initial renewable portfolio standard, which requires the utilities to buy a certain portion of their electricity from renewables, the legislators had the foresight to realize that there would be a big land grab in the Mojave Desert and California Desert, Colorado Desert area. So they actually, alongside the renewable portfolio standard, passed what's called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. So these were really, really big planning efforts. They covered, roughly, 1/5 of California's land area. So they were tasked with actually looking at a lot of land. And it was a collaboration between the Energy Commission, Fish and Wildlife, BLM, and I'm sorry, was it Fish and Game?
CDFW, they changed names.
Okay, yeah, anyhow. And so, bottom line is, actually, the solar programmatic environmental impact statement would propose the solar energy zones. The renewable energy conservation plan would focus on what they called development focus areas. And these were the initial. So this is where we started getting public comments. So this started in about 2009. It was starting to roll out, and they're gathering public comments through 2010, 2011. And these were the initial solar energy zones. And this was interesting because we actually saw public comments inform the withdrawal of some of these solar energy zones, because they had the humility to know that they didn't know everything about these landscapes, and that through the public comments and concerned scientists and concerned local residents, that they would actually learn a lot about this. So a couple of these, Iron Mountain is a little place near Joshua Tree National Park. That's been withdrawn. That's no longer a solar energy zone. Pisgah, that's actually right in the center of the Catellis lands. That's been withdrawn. So, and they actually proposed a couple more in the western Mojave Desert, closer to Tehachapi Pass, which is already seen as a more degraded part of the Mojave Desert. So this was interesting. We were seeing actually how public comments were informing the development of these solar energy zones. So here's a case where we see planning and collaboration and a slow pace, maybe too slow because there are projects being proposed while this is all going on, help inform kind of decision makers about what would be appropriate lands to develop there. So in the end, the BL, out of the 22.5 million, or depending on how you count, 21 million, because they look at some private lands too, they proposed about 300,000 acres of solar energy zones. And they tried to keep that within some reasonable amount to still meet the renewable portfolio standard, knowing how much land it would take to get that. So that was the solar pies. The Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, partly because they had private land, but also because it was a bit of a longer process, brought on more land for development. So they suggest about 2 million acres of what they call development focus areas, DFAs. Now, even though they proposed these solar energy zones, they didn't say you couldn't build projects anywhere else. So 19 million acres remained as what they call variance lands. And that's a different approach here. So the other projects that were proposed under, they call this, by the way, the Great Western Solar Plan. Other projects could be, so projects that were proposed in the solar energy zone would get a streamlined review process. Essentially, they would know that the projects would be approved because they've already done the programmatic environmental impact statement and identified the issues and what the mitigations might have to be. Variance lands basically said you could still kind of propose anywhere, we'll consider it, But the BLM had the authority at that point to say no to projects directly without even opening it up for kind of public comment or